All right, welcome everybody to what is normally the weekly Kubernetes community meeting. This week's meeting will not be a normal meeting. What this is the Kubernetes release retrospective for the 1.14 release. What this is after we've done a Kubernetes release, this community meeting is mostly for the release team and SIG release and SIGs to talk about how the release went and things like that. So I'm about to hand that out, but before we start, please be advised that this meeting is being live streamed to YouTube and recorded, and this is a public meeting as well, so everything that you say will be in the public record. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our released lead for 1.14, which is Mr. Aaron Krickenberger. Take it away.
Hi, everybody. I'm Aaron of Sigbeard. So technically, I am not supposed to be the moderator for this retrospective, but the moderator who said they were going to show up has not yet. So I thought I would ramble for a few minutes to try and give them time. And if not...
Are you talking about me, Aaron?
Yeah, that's exactly who I'm talking about.
I've been here.
Okay. I didn't see you on video. So first off, before I get to all of that, today's cat t-shirt is a cat in an ice cream cone that's slowly melting. I really wanted to wear this shirt for Code Thaw, but I couldn't quite get it in time. So I shared it with the release team on the Tuesday of Code Thaw, but I realized this hasn't made an appearance at the community meeting. So I have now successfully completed my goal of wearing a different cat t-shirt every week during the Kubernetes 1.14 release lifecycle. Thank you all. This has been a wonderful accomplishment. And that's one of the first things that I think went well for this release. And so I'm going to hand off to Jace to help us talk about what we did during the release cycle, what we liked about it, what we didn't like about it, what we might do differently. So Jace, you want to take it away?
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, I'm thrilled and honored to be conducting another retrospective for the community. The first one I did for the community was back in 1.3. So it's been a long track record of doing these for the community. And the idea is simply that at release boundaries, it's a great time to capture some of the things that go right and wrong and how we deliver our software to the world. And it's a pretty complex process these days. And I feel like the retrospective is an opportunity for us to constructively give feedback and learn. So if you're not in the document, I'm not going to share my screen because I have a convoluted setup here, but if somebody else wants to share, they can. Otherwise, the retro doc is at bit.ly/K8S114-retro. So K8S114-retro. And you can actually see what we're doing here. Before we get started, just to say how this works, I'm going to go through the items. We're going to skip the previous retro follow-up. It's more for introspection on the release team and also the community to see how we did at meeting our commitments from the last retro. Generally, we do really well, which is exciting. So these seem to be making a difference. I want to remind everybody, if you are speaking, that's great. Unmute your microphone. If you're not speaking, please make sure you're muted so there's not ambient noise making it hard for people to speak. Also, be super respectful of this space. We want this to be constructive, and if there's something that comes up that doesn't feel right or that you are having issues with or doesn't feel like it's a safe space, you can definitely contact me privately in chat, and I will be happy to address that. Also, just, if there's something that you wanted to change, make sure that we go after the problem and not the person, and just make this a positive experience for everybody. So without further ado, I'm going to hop down into the retro to what went well. I love this part because it really gives people a chance to shout out and share what went well as we went through this release process. So the first person up is Aaron, and I'll let you have the mic here to go through the first several things and let you go through those items.
Thanks. So yeah, I just saw a set of slides from SREcon that I really liked that talk about how a lot of times when we do retrospectives, we spend way too much time focusing on what went wrong and then think about all sorts of ways that we can prevent failure from happening. And we maybe don't spend enough time focusing on the things that went right and the things that allowed us to remain adaptable and flexible, because after all, we believe that recovery is a better and more effective way of operating than prevention, because sometimes removing friction allows us to go faster and do things better. So with that in mind, I tried to focus on a number of things I thought that went well. First, of course, obviously, all the cat t-shirts. Thank you all so much for the inspiration. That was super fun. I also think that a lot of the deadlines were extremely well respected this release cycle. I don't have in mind exactly how well we've done in past release cycles. So we did have sort of a bonus slippage in the enhancements freeze deadline because of reasons we can talk about later that I felt like were expected and built in. But every other deadline was thoroughly respected. We actually released on time. We didn't cherry pick anything after the cherry pick deadline. And we only, like code thaw happened when it was supposed to happen, and we only had one cherry pick land in between code thaw and the cherry pick deadline. Super cool. I feel like setting up the release schedule to take advantage of weekends as useful soak time for CI signal was part of what lent me confidence to some of our larger decisions. So I had code thaw in mind specifically, as well as go, no go for release. We sort of set up some sort of, for release especially, like we set our cherry pick deadline on a Thursday, thus giving us a Friday and a Saturday and a Sunday of continuous CI signal to more effectively be prepared to make a decision about the release on Monday. That was the scheduling boundary I sort of picked up from 1.13 and wanted to try again. And I also utilized it to a lesser extent for code thaw as well. I felt like putting code thaw near a weekend allowed us to have a bunch of time to evaluate if we were truly ready for code thaw, and gave us some additional time to land in like the last minute things that we needed. So something that we said we would do last time was revisit all of this whole priority, critical, urgent, and milestone, and maybe milestone status approved, for those of you who remember that label. Like, what's all this friction? And what is this thing called code slush? I think I was actually asked about this on the Kubernetes podcast. And we kind of collectively agreed that since nobody could come to a concise definition of code slush, or maybe because everybody kept asking about it, we thought it would be more effective to remove code slush. And thus sort of, instead of using machines to impose friction prior to code freeze, we would just use memes and humans to remind everybody that code freeze was coming, and to be responsible adults and maybe not jerks, and maybe not trying to land massive PRs or massive refactors. And so I have this suspicion that because we did that, more PRs were allowed to flow in prior to entering code freeze. So we had less of this crazy backlog. And as a result, when it came time to enter code thaw, we burned through a slightly smaller PR backlog in under 24 hours, which I think is the fastest time we've ever gone through a PR backlog. So I felt like overall we took this super peaky behavior and managed to smooth it over for a better experience in the 1.14 release, as well as providing a better experience for those people who wanted to start ramping into the 1.15 release. I felt as though the call for release team shadows was heard loud and clear. It was really super encouraging to me to hear and see that there was that much interest to join and help out with the release team. So it's good to know we have that channel, that broadcast channel available, and that people are listening to that. One thing I wanted to give a super special heartfelt thanks for was the release team operating effectively while I was dead to the world and out sick. I was best friends with some combination of flu and strep and could not leave my bed for a significant period of time. And the release team was able to make the appropriate decisions they needed to make and accomplish what they needed to accomplish. I believe part of that is due to the fact that we had been operating as a team for like 9 or 10 weeks by that point. So we had certainly had opportunity to gel. But I think that was just a great sign of a smoothly operating team. I personally had concerns that maybe I talk too much and I have too many opinions, and that I might not leave room for folks to gain confidence that they were able to make effective decisions. And I was really glad to be proven wrong about that. Finally, this was the release where we said everybody must have a KEP, everybody must use a KEP, and I think it's really great that everybody agreed we should do that. So I think just the use of KEPs in itself, entering a KEPtocracy or living on planet Keptune or whatever other crazy KEP puns you want to make, I'm glad that we agreed to do that. I'm also glad that we managed to sort of take this ambiguous KEP concept that was spread between SIG release, SIG PM, and SIG architecture, and agree that SIG PM could own it and kept it classy. Thank you, George. And that SIG architecture sort of pulled their responsibilities back into, they really care about technical review, and they created an API review process to keep that going forward. And then I think SIG release sort of most effectively, there's a good degree of overlap between the enhancements folks in SIG release and attendance at SIG PM. And so I'm encouraged that we have the right group of people who are motivated to improve the process, both from a tactical execution perspective for SIG release, but also strategically for the project as a whole. In reading the contents of the KEPs, I'm sure some of us have opinions on the clarity around all of this, but I will just say, personally speaking, when it came time for me to begin crafting the messaging around Kubernetes and to really be able to articulately describe why people should care about this and what they can do with it now that they couldn't do before, KEPs that had clearly written user stories were 100% invaluable. It was really, really great to be able to get sort of a human readable, plain English description of why I should care about this deeply technical sounding feature. So with that, I will keep quiet and look forward to hearing what other people have to say.
Wow. I had to keep my mouth shut during that. So Tim Pepper, are you perhaps in the peanut gallery here?
Yeah, just keeping with that prior thread of conversation, I wanted to say it was really useful that we had a lot of discussion around supportability and provable readiness on proposed features, and yeah, so just adding that to that punny thread.
Nice. And you actually have the next few things in the retro doc, actually.
Yeah, so the next one, so there's a revision there because I didn't quite understand what Hannes had done, and I was thinking he'd done something on his Sunday, but actually it was just the time difference to Europe. So the positive, useful thing here was that as we've spread the team out and we have more people involved across more time zones, on the actual release day, as we were starting to do the build and staging, that gave us more time. It wasn't just time in one workday's time zone, but he was able to start his workday and get some things going so that as the others of us in further west time zones came online, things were already ready for us. And that was actually a really awesome teamwork. And then the last one of mine here is CI signal. I found it really, really useful that the master blocking boards were cleaned up during the cycle, and this this made it much easier for me to notice some things both on master but also on the patch release branches that follow. So that was a really huge improvement this cycle.
Anything else?
Those are mine.
Cool. So, Jeff.
Awesome. This release, we went with a more editorialized version of the release notes. Rather than going to all the SIGs and pulling them to write out a bunch of themes for the release cycle, we actually just mirrored what the CNCF and the release lead deemed as the major themes of the release, and then kind of highlighted them, including linking to the KEPs for those enhancements. That made the release notes cycle a lot easier to manage, and I also think it improved the readability of the release notes cycle significantly.
Great. Nico, are you here? Well, the comment here is, so bug triage, removals of the priority, critical, urgent, and code/requirements as a whole were both 100% success and removed a lot of toil on both sides of triaging. Contributors, bug triage, release lead. So just as a little bit of editorializing as a former release lead myself, I was concerned when the changes were being proposed, because I felt like the governance that was there was necessary, and I am so thrilled that the strategy here worked. So congratulations to the release team on making this happen and work. That seemed to remove a lot of the agony that we had done in the past. So congrats. I'm going to open up the floor for anybody who has not added anything to the retrospective doc, but has some positive things to say about their experience with the release process, or anybody specifically they want to call out as somebody who they thought did a great job. Just before I hand the mic over to anybody else, I'm going to say, Aaron, you did an amazing job. You truly raised the bar of what it means to be a release leader, and you've made me completely, thoroughly reluctant to ever volunteer now, because I'll just look bad. But anyway, you did a fantastic job. Thank you. And anybody else want to add some comments before we move on to what could have gone better?
I didn't hear that Kubernetes went well.
Just to underscore what Tim said, I think I said it in chat, like, I feel like this release team had more non-US members, more time zone diversity than ever before. And I find that to be incredibly important. I know there are some of us who feel like this project has an overly US Pacific time bias, and it is difficult for people living in the Pacific time zone to recognize that bias. And so we appreciate the push for that. And I also think there is value in having people in different time zones, so that Hannes, for example, could do something on his Monday that would have been kind of a crazy Sunday for a US-based member. So that was phenomenal. And to give some thanks back to you, Jace, I feel like a piece of advice I got from you about being a release lead is that, like, sometimes you just have to do songs and dances to keep everybody entertained and paying attention, because sometimes this stuff can be super boring. So are you entertained? Hopefully it worked.
Yeah, emojis go a long way. I think 110 was the birth of the emoji release. Or actually 1.8 was the original burrito release. So that's good. Anybody else want to add anything before we move on?
Sorry, just one last thing, because I'm not sure I've ever done it before. I did just want to extend a thanks to each member of the release team. I'm not going to have time to name all the shadows, but I think for the leads, like, thank you, Claire Lawrence, thank you, Maria Natala, thank you, Amit Wafi, thank you, Nico Penteridis, thank you, Hannes, thank you, Jim Angel, thank you, Dave Streibel, thank you, Natasha Woods, and thank you to Tim Pepper and Alexandra, who are going to be the patch release managers for this. I'm going to give a big hand to all of them, because they did, like, I was just here doing songs and dances and cat t-shirts. Everybody else did all the real hard work. So thank you.
Yay. All right. So what could have gone better? Aaron, you've got the floor here for a bit. I'll turn the microphone off and you go ahead.
Okay. I will try to be quick about some of this. Shadow selection took too long for me to feel comfortable. I talked about the team gelling. I wish I had gotten the opportunity for the team to gel sooner. And I felt like the amount of time I had to wait for shadows to roll in and for leads to figure out how they were going to interact with their shadows was a little bit too long. I attribute some of this to entering this weird holiday slump. I attribute some of it to kind of figuring out the shadow survey like as the release was starting to go on. So, excuse me, I feel like there could be more dedicated attention paid to that. It's really difficult to expect the release lead to simultaneously focus on the release going out the door and then also focus on getting a new release team built and how to most effectively do that. We've had discussion in SIG release about making the release team like a formally owned sub-project, the owners of which would be all of the emeritus release leads who could more effectively steward what's going on going forward while the current release lead focuses on what's happening there. So I know Josh Burkus is doing a number of great things there. I feel like that's all I want to say on that topic. Figuring out all of the requirements to be a release team member, I felt like that dragged out over time. I showed up to something where there were a bunch of documents scattered all over the place. There were 3 different Google groups, SIG release, release team, and Kubernetes milestone burn down. There was no clear way of using those on which docs. And it took me a while to figure out what's like. I couldn't give people a checklist. I believe that Mike Arpaia has since gone through and more or less created that checklist. And I still have some cleanup work to do on killing off the Kubernetes milestone burn down Google group and just leaving it to Kubernetes release team and Kubernetes SIG release. Assuming other people found that like reduction in things helpful. And then the big one would be KEPs, of course. So I feel like I was not terribly effective when it comes to written communication. Previous release leads have used extensive email communication to Kubernetes dev on like a weekly basis. I did not do that. And it could be mea culpa for not broadcasting all of my hopes and dreams about KEPs there. It also could be that I was scrambling to build consensus around the use of KEPs while at the same time being in the middle of the release cycle. And it would have been cool to have all of that consensus built and the template ready to go and the checklist ready to go, all prior to the release happening. I think like I started to try and build consensus and get agreement that we wanted to move in this direction with a lot of people in person at KubeCon at the Contributor Summit in Seattle. So, for example, I felt like I had a pretty concise list of like KEPs need to have a test plan and graduation criteria. And then when I tried to get this on the KEP template so that people would have a really easy thing to copy paste from, I ended up in SIG Bike Shed with lots and lots of pontification and strong opinions from folks in SIG architecture and SIG PM about trying to get things super perfect forever. And I really just wanted to get to a state of merge and iterate and to figure out how to most effectively do that going forward. So like as a result, there were a lot of people, despite like Claire and myself and other folks going to a bunch of SIG meetings personally and answering questions on Slack and trying to get people to show up in the SIG PM channel and to the SIG PM meetings to talk about all things KEP related, there were still a variety of people who were surprised. That's fine, we're humans, there's always going to be surprise. A lot of people, some people seem to be surprised that KEPs were mandatory. I feel like I was very explicit about that in all the channels, except for emails. There's no clear definition around what implementable means. I think that's still an open question today. And I'm okay with that. Let's see. So, like, I acknowledge all of this. I still feel like it was better to push us all forward. I think one of the ways I describe this on the podcast is that we are all humans, and humans are messy, And my goal was to get everybody to kind of put their mess into the same pile so that we could all agree that's where the mess lives, and then start to maybe like clean it up and organize it. So I'm looking forward to how we can clean things up, add a little more structure, do a little more linting, maybe have some consistency about what test plans are and what graduation criteria are. And so with all of that, I will I will tee off to Claire to add her comments on CAPS.
Yeah, I think most of my comments on CAPS are very similar to what you just shared, Aaron. I think for me, the biggest thing I noticed, especially as we were getting closer to code freeze, is looking at consistency in terms of testing plans, because I think when I did a first pass, about 50% of the CAPS did not have any testing plans that could be found. And of the 50% that did, the quality across the bar was very spread. So I think just ways to let people have better ideas around what requirements we want, and like even within those requirements, like when we say testing plans, like what does a good testing plan look like? Graduation criteria, like what are we looking for here? I think those were the big pieces I would add, but agree with everything that Aaron said as well.
So to follow up on that, and then I genuinely do want to hear like the community's feedback on CAPS, because this was honestly about making everybody's lives easier, not just the release teams. Like it actually involved a little bit more toil on the release team's behalf. So test plans. If you are releasing an enhancement and it's going to stable and you don't have end-to-end tests, I don't think you have a sufficient test plan. If your test plan consists of telling me we wrote tests, that is not a test plan. The sort of test plan that I really like, if I put on my hat as a former CI Signal, is a test plan that says, here's the test grid dashboard you can go look at so that you can see the tests are green right now, and you can see how long they've been running, and you can see how flaky or not flaky they are. So I understand that some of these were written by very developer-centric mindsets where it's like, look, I wrote the code, just go look at the code. But that's not super helpful for those of us who have to look at large swaths of these all at once. That requires entirely too much deep diving. The other comment would be around graduation criteria. Some people's graduation criteria I felt like was because it's been in beta forever and we want it to be GA now. Okay, cool. But like, what other metrics are you using to decide that it should be stable? This is kind of a rehash of a conversation we've had before, where it turns out there is actually no written down definition of what stable means, what beta means, and what alpha means. We have some of that written down in some places when it comes to API versioning, and maybe potentially a deprecation policy, and maybe potentially upgrade and version skew. But we don't have a consistent bar for everything that goes to stable must at a minimum have end-to-end tests, or maybe have conformance tests, or have such and such user documentation. I'm not really sure what the list of criteria should be. I think it's unfair to expect SIG release to be the SIG to enforce those criteria consistently. I'm not sure what the right clearinghouse is for that either. Like, my perspective is I would imagine like SIG docs probably has opinions on the quality of the docs. SIG cluster lifecycle might have opinions on the quality of the upgrade downgrade experience. SIG architecture probably has opinions on the API design principles that are in place. SIG testing probably has opinions on the test coverage. SIG cloud provider might have opinions on how many clouds this thing works on. So I think there needs to be like some central place where we kind of get some consensus on this and document it and evaluate all the CAPs against that bar. Maybe that's SIG PM, since SIG PM owns the CAP process. Maybe it's SIG architecture, since they're trying to sort of centralize all of the consistent design principles used across Kubernetes. Okay, that I think is all the talking I'm going to do. and I'm super curious to hear about other people's opinions on KEPs.
So Aaron, from the things that you mentioned, are there some of the things that we can add to the KEP template itself, like the test grid stuff that you were talking about?
I believe that is probably a reasonable place to put that sort of stuff. I think you probably want like some more documentation around the. So I kind of feel like the documentation around the specific fields and values of KEPs is a little lacking. And there's a lot that spells out the what, but maybe not as much the why. And as always, I tend to have an opinion that like things that get too wordy will make my eyes glaze over and I won't actually read them. And I have concerns that maybe the KEP template as it exists today has gotten that long. But I do think that would be a good place to start.
Any other thoughts on KEPs? I have thoughts, but I'm waiting until other people speak. So I guess my concern is when we talk about adding things to the KEP, I feel like sometimes we're doing KEPs, but we don't really know why or what the specific purpose is. Like for me, the original purpose was intended to sort of gate the work that was going into releases so that we were having less false start features and that there was some planning around how things are going to be staffed out, and make sure that if there are dependencies that you untangle those before you start work. And that was sort of the implementable idea, was that you're signaling that this is a funded thing that's got people lined up behind it. It's ready to chip work off of and implement. So I feel like there's a lot of things that there's a lot of aspirational things about KEPs, but what people are experiencing from it is a lot of toil and not a lot of value. In SIG-PM, we've been talking about maybe the idea of doing a retro specifically around KEPs with each of the SIGs who submitted KEPs for this last release cycle, and maybe we could get more feedback and just make sure that everybody's aligned around what are we trying to accomplish with this? Does it do what we need? Is it too complex? Is it not have enough elements and whatnot? But essentially, I think we're at a point in the evolution of this that we need to do a reboot on KEPs just to verify that we're doing what we need to do, because now we're getting traction on it, and I think it's a good time to do that. So that's just my personal take, being in SIG architecture, SIG-PM, and also involved in the release.
I fully agree with that. I felt like I didn't have the bandwidth to like greatly simplify or improve the KEP experience. I made the decision to be a bull in a china shop and move us towards KEPs, and I do think they need simplification. I am hesitant to use the term reboot, but I think certainly getting clear expectations sounds like a good idea to me. Some amount of, so I was also really warned that like doing this without any kind of automation would be a super painful experience. And yep, totally get that. I agree. I think now is the time now that we're all in this one place, I feel like now is the time for us to identify the areas where automation could make our lives simpler. I think a super great initial start would be to make sure that the enhancement tracking issues don't link to PRs, but they instead link directly to the KEP, which is what the template for those new issues is today. But there needs to be some cleanup done on all of the previous PRs. Because once you have that, then you can make it easier for tooling to like crawl all of them and parse out what we need to parse out. Maybe remove some of the human toil in maintaining a spreadsheet, stuff like that.
If you could do me a favor, Aaron, and put those in the things we'll do differently, or at least some note of that would be super helpful, if it's not already there. Okay, moving along. George, quick thing here on CI signal. No, George. Basically saying that the team could be larger on CI signal. 100%. There are times where that's always understaffed. So maybe that's something that happens at burn down time. I don't know. Tim, you got a few here?
Yeah, this first one is similar to that. For a couple cycles, we've been kicking around whether issue triage and CI signal should be combined together. So I just wanted to throw it out there just to see if we have anybody from issue triage or CI signal who felt like together they would have been one.
So I had some connection with CI signal with the release. I'm actually not sure. So CI signal has been a typically busy place to be. It's a fairly time-consuming role, both for the lead and for the shadows. From the involvement that I've seen with the certain involvement that I've seen from the back triage team, it's probably quite similar. But what I'm starting to think is whether it makes sense to just look at the distinct problems that the two teams are solving and maybe organize around these. I just worry that if we end up merging them, that team might end up doing a little bit too much. So then it gets challenging to coordinate amongst themselves to keep track of how things are progressing and so on and so forth. So I think it does make sense to an extent because there is quite a bit of overlap, especially around priorities of issues and communications with SIGs. But I would just like to look at that with a little bit more consideration around the load of work that team would have to do.
That reminds me also, we've talked about trying to figure out tooling in this space because there's a project management aspect of just keeping track of all the things, and it's very difficult in GitHub alone.
Yeah, and I know that at least for CI signal, that's something that we experimented with this week. I think we reached a solution that worked for us in the end, or rather a combination of solutions. But it is very much an open question. The other, like specific to CI signal, for example, something else that I'm thinking is that there's always almost two threads. There is just long-term stability and the category of important but not urgent things that sometimes end up getting punted again and again to the future. And then there's the more urgent stuff that's related to the current release, that's maybe consistently failing tests, that also need quite a bit of attention. So there is an argument in my head for even splitting the CI signal team into sub teams that could each focus a bit more on different priorities.
That's definitely something we should capture in what we'll try differently. So if somebody's feeling inclined to add that to that section, that would be super helpful. Or Maria, if you want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I have one follow-on comment to that, if that's okay, which is that part of what I worked with Maria and some other folks on during KubeCon North America in December was to just do a brain dump of all of the things we could do to help deflake the project. Then we created a GitHub label for this so you could consistently query for it across the project. We created a project board, and then nothing happened because it's an unstaffed, unfunded effort. I believe it is. So this is something that SIG testing explicitly calls out of scope. We don't write your tests for you, so we're not going to troubleshoot your tests for you. You as developers who write features and then write tests to exercise those features should make sure that your tests pass. But we should make sure we have tooling in place to help you more effectively identify tests. There's a part of me that feels like this is one of those cases where like everybody's responsible, but unfortunately that leads to the tragedy of the commons where nobody feels like they're responsible for this stuff. I also feel like it's unfair to put this burden on the release team. They're focused solely on like making sure we are good to go. I don't think they should be focused on doing a lot of troubleshooting and triaging and fixing. That said, if organizationally there are people who want to step up and help out with all of that stuff, I'm happy to have them live wherever just to have that effort happen. To me, it might be like a working group or something. But we do have at least like some of that work called out, some of that backlog available. Just needs people to do it.
Great. Tim, do you want to go ahead and continue with the next few points? Or did we capture what you needed?
So I think so just trying to capture in the notes what we're saying there also. So the next unique one, I believe, is around dependency management. We've been increasingly having discussions around how actively we manage dependencies. And in this cycle, it came up with respect to Golang. We had a realization a tad late that for the Kubernetes 1.14 support lifecycle, which basically runs through year-end 2019, Golang that we've used and have under test, or had under test, Golang 1.11 was going to go out of support in August-ish of this year. So we made a kind of late call to switch over to Golang 1.12 because its support lifetime would carry through the Kubernetes 1.14 support lifetime. But we did that relatively late in the cycle, and it caused a bit of stress and worry, and we had to really watch CI and all of that to make sure that things worked. We've had some observations there with Docker, and then just this last week or two, there's been some things around CNI that have come up. So not proposing a solution, but just calling out that we continue to have this issue and need to think better about how we articulate our dependency set and choose and make active early choices on lining them up for the cycle.
Great. Thanks. Jeff, do you want to go to your next point?
Yeah, it kind of is part of the whole dependency discussion. So as part of release notes, you have to update all of the external dependencies that a release may or may not be changing. And I am assuming over the many releases we've had, it's gotten as granular as what Ruby library something in cluster add-ons is using to talk to Elasticsearch. And I feel like we should really only be talking about the dependencies that the binaries that we are building and shipping actually rely on, rather than all of these other separate dependencies.
All right. Looks like you've got a few different things you want to hit. And then after this, do you want to hand it off to Jim?
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to make sure there wasn't any other dependency talk because we're about to switch gears. So right now we have two different processes to generate release notes. For those of you that aren't aware, Anago, which is the big suite of how to release things, has a means of generating release notes. It generates the markdown and that actually commits it. And then we have an awesome release notes markdown generator that Mike wrote. Those are two completely separate code bases. They do completely different things. And I feel like that was a little bit confusing when we were trying to figure out where we needed to write our markdown for the release tool to actually pick it up. And when we were trying to fix certain bugs that we found in the release notes tool, where to go. So I think it might be something worthwhile combining those two efforts. So we're using the same release notes tool everywhere.
All right. Anything else there before we move on to Jim?
I don't think so.
If Jim's here. Paging Jim. Doesn't look like so. Let's see, test document generation earlier in the cycle to identify issues.
Yeah, I can speak to one of the issues that rolled up.
Okay.
So reference docs, there were apparently issues generating API reference documentation for capital R reasons that I can't articulate here, but Jim made it sound like it was death by 1,000 paper cuts rather than one clear, unambiguous fix. And so I think that's why we're talking here about would have been useful to go through that process sort of continuously to catch failures in that as they cropped up rather than waiting until the very end and, oh, whoops, our reference docs aren't generating. That's my guess. Back to you, Jeff.
Yep.
Yeah.
I probably should have moved that up to right after the Inago thing. One thing that wound up happening this release was right as Hannes was pressing the big red button, we realized that a PR that we were hoping to merge in for like just spelling fixes did not actually get merged in before the big red button was pressed. So we had to then go and quickly PR into both master and release 114, the spelling fixes and phrasing changes for release notes. So having like almost a go, no go, or validating that there are no PRs going into release notes before the big red button is pressed, probably a good idea.
Yeah, I can accept blame for that. So what happened is I did my usual /LGTM/approve on the PRs, and then I trusted that our awesome test infrastructure would go ahead and merge everything like it always does. Except in this one particular case, the PR was opened up as a draft PR, which is this new lovely feature that GitHub introduced a little while ago. But unfortunately, GitHub's API is slightly inconsistent between the v3 and the v4 API in the events that it sends. And so our merge infrastructure did not recognize when that PR got switched from draft to actual. And this isn't about articulating that specific failure. I agree with you. The meta problem here is I didn't actually go verify that everything was merged before I said yes. But I'm trying to spell this particular thing out about draft PRs just because other people watch this video, and I'm trying to warn you, if you use draft PRs right now, you might have a bad time. This is something that both Test Infra is aware of and has been trying to work with GitHub on, but this is also because it's not exactly a super stable GitHub feature. Like anytime you use a GitHub thing that if you go to their API documentation, they say you have to add this application/foo octopus monkey or whatever header to get it, it's probably going to be a little wonky for a while. Anyway, thank you for raising that. My bad. Thank you for opening the follow-up PRs to close it out.
The dreaded big red button. Let's see, Maria, do you want to head up the next few items here and then hand it off to Aaron?
Sure. So I've got a couple, I think, that are more questions than they are observations of things that went wrong. So the first one was around Golang 112. And my question is, we've done, from what I've seen, like a couple of Golang bumps over recent releases. Do we feel that we have enough material and enough experience and enough war stories to put together some sort of a dry run or test drive CI that we could just run before actually bumping Golang in the core code base? And would that even be useful?
Hi, just something to add here. I don't know if Jordan is on. Jordan, are you? Okay. So yes, we definitely need to be, at least for 115, we should try to have a place where we can test the scalability stuff, because if you look at 75833, they smell a regression. So this is something that we need to do urgently somehow. I think when we were trying to do the 112.1, I think there were some suggestions on how we could be testing 112.1 before we switched over to 112 from 112.0 to 112.1. But I think it's going to be more urgent now to be able to simultaneously test multiple versions of Go.
Yeah, like apparently that wasn't the last time I was going to talk. So part of my concern here is that it is not Sigrelease's job to go watch these latency graphs or whatever. Like part of the switch to a major dependency change is to get the appropriate SIG to say, yes, this looks good to us, or no, this does not. And I very specifically made sure to include the chairs of SIG scalability to get their buy-in on whether or not we were good to go. And so what I'm hearing is they did not effectively evaluate their test results to give me a good go, no-go decision.
Oh, this is not pointing blame, Aaron. This is more about we are missing a capability in our test harness, which is
I'm getting there.
Yeah.
Because part of why we involve them is to see these sorts of performance issues involve spinning up 5,000 nodes. And we're not I mean, I can't fully speak on behalf of my employer, but I feel like we're probably not going to spin up multiple 5,000 node clusters in parallel just for testing purposes to satisfy some kind of test matrix. So while I agree it is possible to change the version to get some sort of, there are issues in test infra, I just don't have them offhand, to like check against Golang head, for example, would be really cool. And we could do a sanity check. But that sanity check is only ever going to use a subset of the full set of tests that we run. For example, one of the problems we ran into with Golang 112 was only uncovered by an upgrade test that takes 17 hours to run. And that's maybe a whole other story, but like just like, so forking off the entire set of tests that we run just to run against the new version of Go is likely not feasible from a cost perspective. And then forking off a subset of the tests would probably be useful, but would not have caught either the problem you're raising or the problem that we ran into.
Aaron, to be fair, scalability stuff, this is not the first time it's come up. It's come up multiple times before. So this specific job in scalability, yes, I agree. The 112.0, 112.1, the bug fix that we had, that is something one-off, and we are probably never going to see something like that again.
Yes, I also am not trying to point fingers, but I do feel like I would appreciate more diligent, focused attention on scalability consistently throughout the release cycle to make sure it doesn't always come up at the very last. But it could be that we consider to help with that we just don't make any large, like we could try to not make any large changes that we know will impact performance prior to release. But I also feel like we have historically found that there are what appear to be harmless changes that end up introducing regressions at the very last. So no matter how diligent we are about preventing change to make sure these huge long tests won't change on us, like it does always tend to happen at the end. The pattern I often repeat with scalability is like, how can we find out about this stuff more quickly, more frequently? Are there ways to see these performance impacts without having to wait for a 5,000 node cluster to stand up? I personally feel like I have not seen an answer to that question about like whether these regressions are caught with smaller clusters or whether the kubemark simulations more effectively simulate all of this stuff. And so it bugs me a little bit. Like I feel like some of the I'm going off on a tangent now and I will stop after this, but some of the longest running jobs against pull requests today are jobs that spin up a 100 node cluster, because theoretically that would allow us to catch performance regressions earlier. But I'm not sure that they are actually of value in that regard. And if they're not, then I want them to go away so that we can merge PRs more quickly.
So what I'm hearing very clearly here is the SIG scalability needs to be staffed up. So if you're in this call right now and you're interested, go to the SIG scalability README and sign up, because this is one of those efforts that is chronically understaffed, comes up at the last minute, and it has been, in my experience as release lead, the uniform thing that always slows a release down. So let's fix that with community effort. That's how we do it.
Right, and if your employer needs us to support large clusters, then you definitely need to get them to run these tests for us.
100%. Lubomir, I think you have the last comment, and then we'll go ahead and call it.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we had a little bit of time, like something like few hours between the actual cut of the RC1 and the time when cold tau began. So we discussed with Aaron and Hannes that we may want to have a better sync point between the two. Possibly right after the RC email is received by everyone, everyone should know that this is called Tau now.
Yep, I absolutely agree with you. For what it's worth, I adapted the documentation for the release branch management rulebook a bit to call that out, that we should lift code freeze as soon as RC1 is cut. Hopefully that helps a bit.
The human reason I felt like there was that delay was to be sympathetic. So we had called out all of our major deadlines as end of day Pacific, since, like it or not, Pacific is where the majority of contributions for this project come from. So we felt like end of day Pacific was a sane deadline. However, our release branch manager is in a European time zone. And so expecting them to wait all the way to end of day Pacific to cut a release to line up with that sync point, probably not the greatest expectation of work-life balance. So we ended up cutting the RC1 in a time that made sense for Europe, but left the code thaw time as previously announced and scheduled at Pacific time. Mea culpa, I totally agree. They should be synced up and lined up. So maybe that begs the question is a fallacy. It's not that. That's not what I'm trying to say. It prompts the question, like, is end of day Pacific always a reasonable time? Maybe we shuffle it back to noon or morning or something like that. Because I do agree, having them be identical is perfect. That way you know the release candidate corresponds to exactly what is in the release branch. Whereas because of that window, what was in the release branch differed ever so slightly from the release candidate.
Great. Let's open the floor here for the next minute or two. Anything else that people felt like was friction and needed to change?
One piece of feedback I would like to solicit. You don't have to tell it to my face, but I'm curious what you as a community think. Maybe you can all tell Chase or something. But I mentioned sort of up top how I hadn't been sending out weekly emails. And nobody's told me they didn't like that. Nobody's told me they really liked that. So this is, I forget the name of the paradox right now. It's not clear to me whether that was a good pattern to continue or whether Claire, as the incoming release manager, should go back to weekly emails as yet another communication channel to broadcast information on. So I feel like that would be a useful point of feedback for our incoming release team.
Aaron, personally, yes, I would have liked to seen that, especially because not everybody is tuned in to the regular cadence of the SIG release, right?
Just real quick, Aaron, I know it feels like project-wide it's so much easier to just talk about things in the Zoom meeting and forget that, you know, there are decisions and do-outs and announcements that we really need to be pushing to lists. I don't think it's just a release team thing, but
it's not. That's true. So I tried to communicate status and things that were important in a couple different forums. I would do it weekly at the release team meeting and with those meeting notes that are publicly available. And then I would do it again at the community meeting with those meeting notes that are publicly available. And so I could have just copy pasted that stuff into an email and sent it out. Actually, fun fact, if you read the community hosting template, it says that the host is supposed to email the meeting notes of the community meeting to Kubernetes dev when the community meeting is over. But that hasn't happened in years, I think. And so I just want to try and reduce the amount of time I have to try and like distill and summarize and send stuff out to people. But I agree, like I suspect most people would have preferred email communication in addition to all the other forms of communication I was doing.
All right, Aaron. Thank you.
All right, y'all. It is 10:59 a.m. Pacific. We are at the top of the hour and the end of our meeting. I want to thank you all for another great retrospective, and hopefully this was useful to you all. If there's feedback on my moderation or things we could do better for the retro itself, definitely reach out to me and let me know. And SIG release will probably pick up the what we'll do differently in the release team as well, so hopefully that will be a continued discussion. George, anything before we call it?
Yes, so I owe the folks that were scheduled to do a demo an apology, because we didn't tell them that we were doing a release retro. So they're going to go next week. So we're going to have 2 demos next week, just normal community meeting next week. Thanks, everyone. Any last minute announcements? Anybody? Great. Happy Thursday.
Happy Thursday.